and ordered printed. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 4th, 2021, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Madam Speaker, it is my privilege to proceed under this special order of the Congressional Black Caucus, and I ask unanimous consent that members may have 5 days to submit additional material and statements.
Without objection.
Thank you. It's my pleasure now to, as we begin to frame this very important week, which is to commemorate Juneteenth, the second acknowledgement of the federal holiday created on June 17, 2021 by President Joe Biden. Present was, of course, Vice President Kamala Harris, and the first holiday for nearly 40 years, federal holiday, was established to be able to yield to the distinguished gentlelady from Ohio, whose vision has helped us craft this recognition and this Congressional Black Caucus special order, and her recognition of the cruciality of honoring those that have never been honored in the acknowledgement of Juneteenth, a day of freedom, and as well recognizing H.R. 40, the Commission to Study Slavery and Develop Reparation Proposals. We thank her for her leadership and her guidance. The Honorable Joyce Beatty, the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. It is my privilege to yield to her now for such time as she may consume.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you to our chairwoman, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, chair of our special order, executive board member, a person who you want to be out front, whether it is an issue on civil rights, criminal justice, reparations, voting rights, domestic violence. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee has earned this day and this right. I could not think of a better person to stand here as we talk about commemorating Juneteenth. We know the history all too well of what happened in Texas. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee hails from Texas. So today, as we talk about Black excellence, as we talk about the members of the Congressional Black Caucus, Madam Speaker, we speak to America tonight. We want America to know that as we commemorate Juneteenth, it is about our work, it is about our scholarship, it is about our fight. So you will hear a broad range of issues that we are so proud to stand up for and let America know we are there. And I could not think of a better issue to weave into Juneteenth than reparations, H.R. 40, Sheila Jackson Lee. If you've been in the room with her, you've heard her say it at the White House, you've heard her say it in caucus, you've heard her go in the halls of Congress talking about H.R. 40. I could stop there, but I can tell you that piece of legislation has her fingerprints on it and the signature of 200 members plus. And so, what a great way for me to start and to stand here as chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. Tonight we commemorate a day in our nation's history that can only be described as a celebration of freedom, Juneteenth. You see, on June 19, 1865, enslaved African Americans in Texas received the joyous news of emancipation and that they were finally free. And despite that, we are still enslaved in many ways. So it is critical for America to know of our fight and our progress. Tonight you will hear members discuss our work on criminal justice, reparations, to uplifting of our Black men and boys, racial equity, fair housing, and so much more. And we are leading the charge and laying the foundation to deliver on voting rights, student loan debt, and gun control. Tonight, we tell our story of Black excellence. Nearly 1 year ago, on June 17, 2021, the Congressional Black Caucus went to the White House and joined with President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris as he signed the historic legislation that made Juneteenth the 11th national holiday and the first new federal holiday since Martin Luther King Day in 1983. Now, more than a century and a half later, I stand here as chairwoman of the largest congressional Black caucus in the nation's history. Every day, 58 Black members of the Congressional Black Caucus legislate in these halls built by our enslaved ancestors. 6 full committee chairs, chair of the Democratic Caucus, the House Majority Whip, former senior advisor to the President, and Vice President of these United States, all active and former members of the Congressional Black Caucus. Madam Speaker, we have come so far, but we realize there is still work to do. Yes, from being considered 1/3 of a person, we want the American people to know that we continue fighting. It was the Congressional Black Caucus that brokered the $1 trillion infrastructure law for our roads and bridges and provided little children broadband network. It was the $1,400 in the pockets of everyday Americans, the $300 a month for working families with children, the historic funding for HBCUs, and each Congressional Black Caucus member bringing community dollars to their district. And we have seen one of the most consequential civil rights legislation aiming at interrupting the school-to-prison pipeline and uplifting Black men and boys, the U.S. Commission on Social Status of Black Men and Boys, created and birthed by our very own Congressional Black Caucus member, Congresswoman Frederica Wilson, a sojourner for our Black men and boys. Tonight, you will hear from other members of the Congressional Black Caucus commemorate our successes in the spirit of Juneteenth. But, Madam Speaker, in the immortal words of Dr. Maya Angelou, bringing the gifts that our ancestors gave, we are the dream and the hope of the slave. I am proud to proclaim on this floor tonight, Happy Juneteenth Day. Our power, our message. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for her distinguished presentation, and I'll just take a moment as other members are on the floor so that I can at least set the framework of this evening, of which you have done so ably. I think the cornerstone of the chairwoman's remarks is that we have been building on Juneteenth as members of the Congressional Black Caucus for all of our tenure in Congress. We have done it by the myriad of legislative initiatives that continue to build, to repair what has generated from the 246 years of slavery. So let me first of all read into the record about that order of General Gordon Granger on June 19, 1865, on the shores of Galveston, Texas. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive Order of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection the heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They're informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Most people have not heard the entire order. For as Union soldiers up to 200,000 fought in the Civil War and died, as Union soldiers were killed by Confederate soldiers rather than under the laws of the military protocol captured as prisoners of war, they shot them dead. Blood was shed by slaves or freedmen. And the order that we all so often praise, let me be very clear. General Granger said, you're free, but your posture, your framework, the guidepost is you are not to leave. You are now employer and not even employee, but hired labor. There was no obligation for freedmen to stay and take a job. And most of the slaves looked askance. They didn't understand what employer was. That's not a word that they had ever heard of any large sense. And hired labor, we're free. Tonight we speak about freedom. They were free, but yet, even in the goodness of that order, they were advised to remain at their present homes, probably something that had been given to the plantation and the masters, and to work for wages. Did not say what kind of wages, what kind of work conditions you had, what kind of workman's comp, insurance. No. They're informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and as if that had been the slaves' mantra, they even challenged them to not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Let me tell you by this very potent picture what the ancestors had gone through for 246 years. For those who were born, who lived and died in the brutality of slavery, this was their lot. And the separation of families, the unnaming of families, they had first names, or they were called husband and wife, or husband or wife. They were not given the dignity of name. This is their lot. And so Juneteenth, its essence was freedom, but the words were hesitant. Even though slavery had been abolished, as most people will know, except for convicted persons, which makes them it as a challenged amendment, if you will, because that process of prisoners continued into the 20th century. But I say this to say, as we begin our discussion, and I will just make this point, I am here to honor those who never were honored, whose names were never called, whose funerals or burials were never given the dignity of a human being. They died as less than a person, as the Constitution dictated, for at least a century. They never had that dignity of who they were and the work they did in the building of the economic engine of America and the shedding of blood in both the Revolutionary War and wars in between and the Civil War. And so as we look at these scars, that is why I'm so adamant about H.R. 40, the Commission to Study Slavery and Develop Reparation Proposals, because even in the pronouncement of freedom, Chairwoman Beatty, Chairman Jeffries, Chair Bonnie Watson Coleman, even in the proclamation of freedom, they did not have freedom. They were qualified in their freedom. And with that in mind, I continue to raise up this bill with almost 217 co-sponsors to this week even become an executive order, pronouncement of such, or ultimately passed by the House of Representatives. That is H.R. 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals. I'm prepared to yield to the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, who has certainly evidenced the essence of freedom in our work together in the criminal justice reform. I think he well knows what the 13th Amendment left us with. And as well as I read General Granger Order number 15, I hope that he has heard, even in freedom, we were given qualifications and structures and strictures, and we were denied the true freedom of this nation. It's my privilege to yield to the gentleman from New York, Chairman Jeffries.
Thank you, the distinguished gentlelady from the great state of Texas, the chair of the crime subcommittee, Sheila Jackson Lee, for yielding and for her leadership in so many different areas, particularly as it relates to the effort to make sure that we explore to the greatest extent possible the legacy that still remains in terms of the damage that was done relative to the enslavement of people of African descent here in the United States of America. We've come a long way in this great country, but we still have a long way to go. Racism in the soil of America going all the way back to 1619. It's an honor to stand here with my distinguished colleagues, the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Honorable Joyce Beatty, who has done such an amazing job leading us forward in this Congress, and of course the distinguished gentlelady from the great state of New Jersey, Congresswoman Bonnie Watson-Coleman. And I thank you, Madam Speaker, for presiding over this particular discussion. Juneteenth, as a federal holiday, is an amazing development. That effort was led by the Congressional Black Caucus, and of course the legislation signed into law by President Joe Biden. I thank the distinguished gentlelady from Texas for leading the effort. I first came to know of Juneteenth when I was a student at the LBJ School of Public Affairs in the summer between my junior year and my senior year, and had not heard, I'm just a kid from Brooklyn, had not heard about Juneteenth. And folks down there said, we're going to celebrate Juneteenth. I said, June what? I was unsure of it. Growing up proudly as an African American in New York City, something that had been in the heart and soul of the people of Texas and throughout the South, but hadn't necessarily made it into my consciousness. I was thankful for that moment. And I think about that journey to a point now where we have a federal holiday to mark the journey of African Americans and the progress that has been made, but the need to continue, of course, to do more. As Chairwoman Beatty talked about some of the things that the Congressional Black Caucus has worked on, I think this Juneteenth marker is an important point in time, both to reflect upon what has been done, but also, of course, to mark what still needs to be done to continue America's march toward a more perfect union. We weren't promised a perfect country. We know the framers of this great republic themselves were imperfect. We were never promised a perfect country. Slavery was in existence when the republic was founded, but they did promise a march toward a more perfect union, that America could try to continue to be the best version of herself. And that's what the Congressional Black Caucus has really been all about. And in our 51 years, I can't stand here in the time that I have to catalog all that has been done. But if you just look at what has occurred in the last 10 or 15 years, signature pieces of legislation, year after year after year. Congressman Danny Davis leading the effort to pass the Second Chance Act to make sure that individuals, incarcerated individuals and others who needed a second chance at life could successfully reintegrate into society. in a way that helps them as individuals, their families, our communities, as well as taxpayers. That was a bill that was signed into law by a Republican president, George Bush, leadership from the Congressional Black Caucus. And certainly in that criminal justice reform space, we know that Chairman Bobby Scott in 2010 led the effort to pass the Fair Sentencing Act, which lowered the 100-to-1 egregious crack cocaine sentencing disparity, that disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, and dropped it down to 18-to-1 in a way that allowed thousands of individuals, the overwhelming majority of whom were black men, to be released back into society to live productive lives. There was still more work that needed to be done. We took up the effort in 2018, and collectively the Congressional Black Caucus passed the First Step Act. Representative Sheila Jackson Lee was very involved in that effort as a member of the Judiciary, Cedric Richmond, Karen Bass, myself, others, Joyce Beatty, Bonnie Watson Coleman, supportive. And we were able to take that 18-to-1 and make it retroactive, which the Senate refused to do in 2010, and enact a wide variety of sentencing reforms that created a fairer, more equitable criminal justice system, resulting in thousands of individuals being able to successfully reintegrate back into society, save taxpayer dollars, but also repaired lives, repaired families, repaired communities. The overwhelming majority of folks, again, who were released, 90% black men. Why? Because it was black men who bore the brunt of the failed war on drugs and the failure of so-called lock 'em up, throw away the key sentencing schemes, all of which didn't make us safer, as people were banished, often for nonviolent drug offenses. That was the Congressional Black Caucus. It was the Congressional Black Caucus led by Frederica Wilson that passed into law the Commission on the Social Status for Black Men and Boys, and signed into law by a Republican president, passed through a Republican-controlled United States Senate, because the Congressional Black Caucus stays on the case. And as was said during the founding, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And the interest is to make sure that these principles, equal protection under the law, liberty and justice for all, fundamental fairness, apply to all Americans, regardless of race. And so that's a very important piece of legislation. That commission is a foundation that, under the leadership of Joyce Beatty, we can continue to make progress, particularly for those black men and boys who have been isolated and under-resourced and targeted in our society. Thankful that during that same Congress, there was an effort to more fully and robustly fund historically black colleges and universities. That effort was led by Representative Alma Adams. It was also legislation that made it through a Republican-controlled Senate, Republican-controlled House, signed into law by a Republican president. The CBC stays on the case. And that certainly is what occurred this particular Congress, with passage of historic infrastructure legislation. That effort was in part when we were at a stalemate led by our chairwoman, Joyce Beatty, who worked to bring the caucus together to a place where we could enact groundbreaking legislation that will create millions of good-paying jobs, make sure that there's clean water in every single community, and we know that it's black communities that often suffer from water that has been poisoned. And of course, it was our great whip, Jim Clyburn, who led the effort to make sure that we put into place a process so that we can get high-speed internet access in every single community. This is the CBC staying on the case. So I'm thankful for the leadership of my colleagues within the Congressional Black Caucus, thankful that our chair has continued to pull us together and lead us in such a phenomenal way. Thankful for Bonnie Watson Coleman, who is one of the most principled public servants you'll find anywhere in these United States. Thankful for Sheila Jackson Lee and what she's doing to lead us forward to examine, through H.R. 40, the legacy of slavery and the fact that perhaps the least that we can do is have a study to figure out the damage that was done through the systematic rape and kidnap and lynching and oppression, decade after decade, century into century, and then its progeny in the context of Jim Crow and the institutional discrimination that remains with us today. The least that perhaps we can do, at some point, figure out how we can study the issue, building upon all of the work that the CBC has been able to do today. Juneteenth gives us an opportunity to mark the progress that we've made, and of course, think about a vision for the future as we continue our long, necessary, and majestic march toward a more perfect union. So thank you, Madam Speaker, for presiding. Thank you to my classmate, my good friend, Joyce Beatty. I certainly approve any message that she articulates, and I thank my colleagues Sheila Jackson Lee and Bonnie Watson Coleman, who are here helping to lead the charge with this special order.
Let me thank the chairman for taking us through this powerful journey of the continued fight for freedom of the Congressional Black Caucus and incorporating all of the relief given to the continued ailments and disparities of African Americans and leading us to H.R. 40, the Commission to Study Slavery and Develop Reparation Proposals, which really are components of the work that we have been doing. It's the building blocks of trying to cure extensive disparities. Certainly our member that has worked on disparities focused on the journey of black women, leading on issues of black woman maternal mortality, as well as my colleague on Homeland Security and a number of other collaboration, is the Honorable Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman, and we're very privileged to yield to her at this time.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank the leader of our Special Order Hour, the magnificent, exquisite, and always on point, Honorable Sheila Jackson Lee. I want to thank her for the work on H.R. 40 and reminding us every day that within that word reparations is repair, and our opportunity to study how we can repair the pain and the injustice that was accorded to our community. I need to recognize my leader, Joyce Beatty, because under her leadership, she's amplified our voice is our power. And on whatever level we decide that we must speak and we must act, Joyce Beatty has reminded us that our voice is our power. Because the Black Caucus believes in exercising that power on behalf of communities that have been underrepresented for so very long, whether it's environmental justice, social justice, criminal justice reform, housing, or just whether or not the whole system needs to be examined as it impacted us. You know, and I want to thank the chairman of our caucus, who took us through a journey that reminded me as I'm sitting there the good work that we have been able to do. I want to tell you that I feel like I'm standing here in a very sacred space. And I want to speak in the spirit that flows through us that was left by a Shirley Chisholm and a Barbara Jordan and a John Lewis and an Elijah Cummings and an Alcee Hastings and so many more that have gone before us and have opened the doors and pushed through the doors so that we might be here this evening to address you. So yes, slavery supposedly Freedom from it came to us in 1865. And today we commemorate and we celebrate this end of slavery and all the progress that we've made over the last 157 years. But you know what? We must also acknowledge, as Chairman Hakeem Jeffries reminded us, the long road ahead toward what would be full equality for Black Americans. So let Juneteenth be not just a celebration or a commemoration, but a rallying cry as we recommit ourselves to the centuries-long struggle for civil rights. Through historic measures like the American Rescue Plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Plan, and executive orders on policing and advancing racial equity, this Biden administration, along with this Congress, has taken important steps to address the unique needs of Black communities across the country. The time is now to keep that momentum going. Our current moment presents an opportunity to dismantle systemic injustices by bringing Black people from the margins to the mainstream of American society. We as a society must stop treating Black people as an afterthought. That means we must take direct action to end the racial discrimination that, contrary to what our colleagues across the aisle might like us to believe, still exists today. It means ensuring that Black people, especially Black women, are in the rooms where decisions are made. It means passing legislation, like the Crown Act, which would put an end to the insidious discrimination against Black people because of their hair. In the fight for a more perfect union, we can and we should and we must think bigger and bolder. Through policy like those that are outlined in the Black Woman Best economic framework, which include everything from a guaranteed basic income to sweeping criminal justice reform, we can bring the Black community from peril to prosperity. And when we do that, we bring everybody else along with us. But only then will all Americans have the freedom to thrive. Today, we celebrate this turning point in our nation's history. Today, we look back on the milestones we've achieved since then. And today, we continue fighting for that more inclusive, that more equitable, that fairer society that really represents the best that America can be. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for bringing to our attention really some very unique aspects, again, of the Congressional Black Caucus and her work. And as I travel the country, it's interesting to hear that our community has been so deprived as it relates to the discrimination against you with respect to your hairstyle, and Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman, among other things, was able to lead on something, and I hear it often, that they are so proud of this legislation because it has given dignity to people whose dignity was taken away. These are the building blocks that the Congressional Black Caucus pours into the symbolism of honoring Juneteenth and H.R. 40, the Commission to Study Slavery. We thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Let me, as I prepare to allow for a additional speaker to come make this point. And let me just take this moment as we prepare to yield. Madam Speaker, would you give us the time, please?
The gentlewoman has 26 minutes remaining.
So let me just put this into the record as I prepare to yield and emphasize what H.R. 40 does. And as I do so, let me emphasize why H.R. 40 is so important. This is what you see, is the hanging of Black men, and it is the presence of individuals who are making a spectacle of this. There's one Black man already on the ground. There's no evidence of a trial, no evidence of guilt, This is an example of what preceded 1865. Because when you talk about H.R. 40, or even when we were trying to make Juneteenth a federal holiday, because I introduced resolutions over and over again and finally got the bill introduced as a federal holiday, which then we proceeded and worked to get it passed, it was always a question, why? It was always a question about this issue of freedom. You're already free. You live in America. And the same goes for this issue of why H.R. 40. Because the continuing ailments that ailed our community did not end. This was obviously not in 1865. This was into the 1900s, the 20th century as evidence, or maybe the late 1800s, that black men were being hung, black women were being raped, separated from families, and the abuse of racism was deep and abiding. The Klan would raid and burn communities, hospitals, churches, homes, and have a reign of terror. And so this work of the Congressional Black Caucus with the many splinters of legislation can be culminated by the passage through a vote on the floor of the House, but through an executive order that clearly would provide an answer to the language here that says, following the abolition of slavery, the United States government at the federal, state, and local level continue to perpetrate, condone, and often profit from practices that continue to brutalize and disadvantage African Americans, including sharecropping, convict leasing, Jim Crow, redlining, unequal education, disproportionate treatment at the hands of the criminal justice system, and lack of access to health care, which Harvard University said if we had it, we would not have been that impacted by COVID in terms of dying and sickness. But this is a symbolic depiction that racism and discrimination continued to exist. And so this legislation was updated to say, and develop reparation proposals. That is the key. It is an action item. We want a response to Black America, a response to African Americans. We want a response to the 57 members of the Congressional Black Caucus coming from a variety of districts, some with small measures of African American, but yet the recognition that wherever they live in America, and as our members represent all people, millions of Americans, they understand the stark disparities that they see even in their congressional districts. That's why we stand here today to honor Juneteenth, which equals freedom, and that's why we are here today to say that we're never giving up the fight, and we are most proud of the fact that we collectively came as a body, embraced our work as individual members, and got Juneteenth signed, and we will now go into this week speaking about freedom, but also speaking about truth and the work we have to do. So it is my pleasure to now, Madam Speaker, at this time, I yield back to the chair so that Representative Beatty may be recognized for the remainder of the hour.
21, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, for the remainder of the hour as the designee of the majority leader.
Madam Speaker, thank you. Tonight, we have heard from leadership in the Congressional Black Caucus, leadership in the Democratic Caucus of the United States Congress. I want to thank Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee for threading the needle, for reminding us of the history of how we started 1863, really, and then 2 years later, 1865, when it was announced that Juneteenth would exist because Black people were free. Juneteenth, Independence Day, Freedom Day, all of it makes a difference for us because we know freedom is never given, it is won. And that is why it gives me great pleasure now, another colleague from the great state of Ohio, someone who knows the value and the importance of fighting because she is a fighter. She is a sojourner who understands that her voice speaks for thousands of individuals, especially Black individuals. But it is a great honor to have a colleague that hails from the same state that I hail from, the great state of Ohio. She walks in the footsteps of a Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, a Congresswoman Stephanie Tubbs Jones, and a congressman and one of the founders of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressman Lou Stokes. So the gentlewoman from Ohio's 11th District, Congresswoman Shontel Brown, it gives me great honor to yield to you.
Caucus colleagues for highlighting the significance of Juneteenth during today's special order hour. Madam Speaker, the date was Monday, June 19, 1865. The location, Galveston, Texas. 2.5 years after President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation and 2 months after the Civil War ended, 250,000 enslaved Black people in Texas still did not know they were free. That was until on that Texas summer day, federal troops rolled into town and a Union general read aloud an order announcing their freedom. Emancipation didn't happen all at once, and slavery wasn't formally abolished until the passage of the 13th Amendment later that year. But that 19th day in June came to be known as Juneteenth, a day celebrating the end of slavery in America. The year following the 1865 Declaration, freedmen in Texas organized the first of what became the annual June 19th celebration. Slowly but surely, Juneteenth celebrations spread across the country. Last year, thanks to the hard work of my friend, my colleague, the dynamic, incomparable Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, President Biden signed a bill into law recognizing Juneteenth as a federal holiday. Juneteenth is a time to celebrate, and it is a time to take pride in the many contributions of African Americans to our society and our country across the generations. But it is also a time of remembrance and action. On Juneteenth, we acknowledge a dark period in our history and its lasting legacy of inequality and injustice, a legacy that continues to influence our country today. We have made much progress as a nation, yet we still have a long way to go. And progress is not possible without a full accounting of both our brightest days and our darkest nights. As we honor those enslaved Texans who finally learned of their freedom 157 years ago, let us recommit to fulfilling the promise of Juneteenth and indeed of our nation at large by fighting for equality, liberty, and justice for all. Thank you, and I yield back.
We stand here listening. We stand here revisiting our history. We stand here thinking about our ancestors. And as members of the Congressional Black Caucus, 50+1 years old, we understand that the fight must continue. We understand when we walk in these hollow halls of justice that we carry that torch, freedom, that torch, justice, liberty for all. It is that responsibility that we acknowledge. It is that responsibility when I think about 173 Black people in the history of this Congress have served. Out of some 12,000 people who have served in these halls, 173 black people. When I think about being the 9th black woman to serve as chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, I think of the other women, the sojourners, the truth tellers, who served as chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. I think of people like Congresswoman Karen Bass, who I followed. I think about Congresswoman, now Secretary of HUD, Marcia Fudge. I think about Congresswoman Maxine Waters, one of 6 black members of Congress serving as chair of the Financial Services Committee. I think about Congresswoman Barbara Lee from California, who is always out in the forefront and reminding us of the words of Shirley Chisholm. I think about Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, another colleague from the great state of Texas. A woman who reminds us about equality and justice and reminds us about the value of collaboration and standing together in unity. She, the founder of the Tri-Caucus, another fighter for justice, someone who mentors us and stands back and gives us enough room so we could lead and follow in her footsteps. So many strong black women in the Congressional Black Caucus. And then there are the men. There are 29 members who are female and 29 members who are male, serving now in the Congressional Black Caucus. So tonight, Madam Speaker, I say thank you, the 2 most powerful words that one can say. I say thank you to our chair of our special order hour, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. And as we begin to bring this night to a close, I'm reminded of so many things that great leaders have said. Someone said, liberty, when it begins to take root, it is a plant of rapid growth. We have begun to take root as members of the Congressional Black Caucus. And we too have that same rapid growth of all the things in this chamber we have brought to the floor, in this chamber that we have voted out and sent to the Senate and to the White House to be signed into law. And so often people will come up to us on the great streets of America and they will say, tell me, what is it that the Congressional Black Caucus is doing? But Madam Speaker, I say no more. No more will you question who we are, because our power and our message of black excellence, of lifting up and elevating our message and power, has rang through the United States of America. Because you see, when you talk about an executive order on police reform, it was the Congressional Black Caucus that was there when the president signed it. When you talk about us dealing with student debt, it is the Congressional Black Caucus that just finished a 2-day issues conference. And we brought before our Congressional Black Caucus issues forum 10 of the top civil rights leaders in America. They didn't bring or send a designee. They came themselves before us. So I want to say, Madam Speaker, that tonight was about Juneteenth. But tonight was also about letting America know that we are fighting for them and that we stand with them, and we understand that we must continue to fight against systemic racism. We must continue to fight for our children and our families. And that's what we do, because we are the Congressional Black Caucus. Our power, our message, Black excellence, unapologetically strong. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back.